What's going on, everybody? Kalipus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my first impressions of the Cricket Innovate E5G. Now this is one of the newer, more entry-level 5G phones from Cricket, and if you're looking for a 5G phone, but you don't want to spend the money on a more premium device, then this phone, along with the Cricket Dream 5G, is definitely going to be one of the more affordable options out there. So in this video, I'm going to be giving you a general overview of this phone's specs and features to give you a better idea of what to expect if you get it. Now before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, before we go into the phone itself, let's take a look at what comes in the box. We got the typical quick start guide here. There's a SIM card removal tool, a USB-C cable, and finally a USB wall adapter, which I'm definitely glad to see here because with a lot of phones nowadays, especially 5G devices for whatever reason, don't seem to be coming with wall adapters anymore. Now moving on to the phone itself, with the Cricket Innovate E5G, we're getting a 6.6-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 269, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So for what it is, definitely not bad here. On one hand, the LCD display is really not that impressive, but at the same time it doesn't really look bad either. At 6.6 inches, we're definitely getting a larger display here, which does tend to be a good thing when you're consuming a lot of content. And in addition to this, with a 20:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a taller and more narrow form factor. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something vertical like browsing the web, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So in general, despite not being the most amazing display, for what it is, I do think it does look pretty decent. One thing I do want to point out though is that the viewing angles really are not the best. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, this phone might be a little hard to see. But again, aside from that, if you're just doing basic activities like watching videos, playing games, browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, this display definitely will get the job done. Now for storage, this phone's getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so while it's not amazing, I do think 64GB for the average person will be at least acceptable. But that being said, if you're more of a power user, if you have a lot of apps and stuff like that, then you might want to consider going for a higher end device that has more storage, because while there was a time where 64GB was technically considered a lot, at this point in 2022, with stuff like apps, the system, and just files in general getting larger and larger, if you are more of a power user, 64GB is going to fill up pretty quickly. Now for security features, this phone does have Face Unlock, as well as a fingerprint scanner right here in the back, so definitely nice to see we're getting both options here. There are lots of phones in this price range, and even slightly above for that matter, that only have one or the other, so if having other options to unlock your phone besides a PIN is important to you, then this is definitely a nice thing to see. But that being said, let's give this fingerprint scanner a try and see how well it works. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, real fast and responsive. And again, this phone does have Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, we got a water drop notch for the front facing camera. This camera is 5 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera, so not really a whole lot of features here. But if you're just taking regular pictures and maybe using portrait mode, then it should at least get the job done. But again, if you're taking a lot of photos and you want a wider variety of features, then I would definitely consider another device that has stuff like an ultra wide camera and a macro camera, like the Cricket Dream 5G for example, which weirdly enough is pretty much in this same price range. Now as for the photo quality, seeing as this is my first impressions video, I haven't actually tested the camera yet, but just going off how phones in this price range typically are, I wouldn't imagine the quality is really going to be that great. Sure, if you're just taking the occasional photo to send to friends and family, or maybe you're just using Snapchat where the quality doesn't really matter a whole lot, in that situation it will at least get the job done. But if you're taking a lot of photos, maybe to share on social media for example, then again, I would definitely consider a higher end device that's not only going to have better photo quality, but overall just more features in general. Now for video, this phone has a max recording quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so no 4K or anything, but then again, in this price range, that's not really surprising. And again, when it comes to the quality, it's pretty much going to be the same as the photos. Sure, if you're recording a video for Snapchat for example, it will get the job done, but for anything else you actually want to keep, again, I would definitely consider a higher end device. Now as far as RAM and processor go, this is pretty much going to be this phone's biggest strength. So with the Cricket Innovate E5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. So as I'm sure you can tell by the name, this is a 5G phone. So again, if you do want 5G connectivity, but you also don't want to spend a lot of money on a more premium device, then this is definitely going to be a good option. Now that being said, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on it, And here are the scores right here. Now, in case you're not too familiar with this test, I do recommend running it on your current phone and then comparing your scores to these, and that'll give you a better idea of whether or not this phone will be a good upgrade for you, because depending on what your current device is, it may or may not be. But in general, from my experience with this phone so far, it has run pretty smoothly. I haven't had any performance issues or anything like that, and while on one hand it's not really the fastest phone out there, compared to most phones in this price range, the performance actually is pretty good. So if you're doing basic activities like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and maybe some light mobile gaming, I would say this phone would definitely get the job done. But of course, if you're really just going to be on your phone a lot, or maybe you're doing stuff like high performance mobile gaming that needs a little bit more processing power, then in that case I would definitely recommend going for a higher end device, because while this phone again is really not a slow phone by any means, if you are more of a heavy user, then you're most likely going to want something a little bit faster. Now, as far as the battery goes, with this phone we're getting a 4000 mAh battery that supports 10 watt fast charging, so definitely not the best battery in the world. Sure, it's better than a 2000 mAh battery, but keep in mind a lot of other phones in this price range, especially 5G phones, are going to have 5000 mAh batteries. So the bottom line is, if battery life is really a priority for you, then you can definitely do better than this phone. But that being said, in general, while a 4000 mAh battery of course is not the biggest battery out there, it's still not terrible, and as long as you're not using the phone really heavily, it's at least going to last you a day. Another thing I do want to point out here is that with the Cricket Innovate E5G, this phone does not have wireless charging, and the reason I bring that up is not because wireless charging is really an expectation in this price range, but because the Cricket Dream 5G is actually really similar to this phone, and that phone does have wireless charging, and again, this phone does not. So if you want wireless charging and you're expecting that feature, definitely don't get these two phones confused, because again, the Cricket Dream 5G does have wireless charging, but this phone, the Cricket Innovate E5G, does not have wireless charging. So again, if you want that feature, you are going to want the Cricket Dream 5G instead, but if you don't care, then just keep in mind, this phone again doesn't have the biggest battery, but it's also not terrible either. So if you want a phone with a decent battery, but it's not really your top priority, then it will at least get the job done. Now, as far as the software goes, this phone does have Android 12, which is definitely a nice thing to see, because although Android 12 of course is not the newest version of Android at this point, there are plenty of phones out there, especially in this price range, that only have Android 11. So if you're not too concerned about getting the latest version of Android, but you want something at least decently newer, then this phone will be a pretty good choice. But that being said, if you are more concerned with getting the latest version of Android, keep in mind, seeing as this is really just a Cricket phone, it's probably not going to be getting any major updates. So again, if you want the newest version of Android and the best software support, I would definitely recommend looking into something like a Samsung Galaxy A series, for example, that's going to have much better software support. Another thing to keep in mind here is that, as you can see from this icon right here, the Cricket Innovate E5G does have NFC, making it one of the most affordable phones with this feature. So if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, then you'll be happy to know, surprisingly, you can do that with this phone. But now that we've gone over some of the specs and features, let's take a closer look at the phone itself. On the left here, we got the slot for the SIM card and the micro SD card. On the bottom, we got the 3.5mm headphone jack, microphone, USB-C port, and the speaker. On the right, we got the power key, volume down, volume up. On the top, we got the noise cancelling microphone. On the back, we got the camera module, flash, and Cricket branding down here. The back is made of sort of a matte material that doesn't really pick up fingerprints, so that's definitely a nice thing to see. But keep in mind, as far as the materials go, the phone is made entirely of plastic, and it definitely doesn't feel very premium, which on one hand is really to be expected with a phone like this, but on the other hand, keep in mind, if you do want something that feels a little higher end, then this is probably going to be a disappointment for you. But in conclusion, my overall first impressions of the Cricket Innovate E5G. In general, I feel like this phone is basically almost a copy of the Cricket Dream 5G, but doesn't have quite as many features. But overall, if the Cricket Dream 5G didn't exist, I would say if you use Cricket and you want an affordable 5G phone, this phone would be a great option. But again, the Cricket Dream 5G is pretty much the same thing, and as of the recording of this video, you can still get it for free. So in general, if you're considering this phone, I honestly would just go with the Cricket Dream 5G, but that deal is probably not going to last forever. And by itself, I do think the Cricket Innovate E5G is actually a pretty good device. I mean, it doesn't have the most amazing display, but it gets the job done. It doesn't have a ton of features, but it does have a really good processor that not only has 5G connectivity, but also really good performance as well. And it has NFC, which again, in this price range is not a feature you're going to see in every phone. So overall, if you are looking for a more affordable 5G phone, then in general, I would say the Cricket Innovate E5G is not a bad choice. Now again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description as they come out, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipaz Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.